think benefits from what you're doing with Facebook or whatever it is on that phone. It's there to make money. If I could have cloned myself, I could have worked 24/7. I would much have preferred to be boring holes in the sky rather than boring holes in the ground. But there are bigger things in life than looking at your Facebook feed and seeing who's given you likes. And the shop steward came in and he said, look, unless you withdraw this requirement, we're all going to go on strike. The reality is that the culture of a lot of companies could be dramatically improved if the top people were committed to being trustworthy and to being trusted.
Welcome everyone, this is The Success Minded. My name's Kane and this is my very first guest for my very first podcast, Don Gordon. Thank you very much for joining me, Don, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks very much, Kane. It's my pleasure and my honour to be here.
Thank you. At the moment, Don's doing quite a bit of work around as a keynote speaker. He's a coach and mentor through AMWA as well as his own personal business. He's a qualified pilot in Australia and America, and he's also the author of From Technocrat to Leader, a very great book that I've personally read and got a lot out of. So again, thank you very much for joining me, Don. To dive right into it, what was life like for you as a child growing up? So I guess what things have helped shape you to become the person you are today?
Right. Well, when I think back on my childhood, I think I was actually an adult in a child's body for many years, because I was really frustrated at the fact that as a child there were so many things I wanted to do but couldn't do. So things like driving and flying, both of which I eventually did. But I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed my childhood in the sense that I used it for exploration, and I eventually became an engineer, but I think I was already an engineer before I formally became one, because I just enjoyed pulling things to bits and actually putting them back together, which a lot of people don't do that second step, making sure they worked, because I've always had a great passion for understanding how things work and why things happen. And that fed later into a number of years that I spent in health and safety management, trying to keep people safe. But yes, I have to say that my childhood was one of exploration, really. And my father worked for a major airline in Australia, which was then known as TAA, Trans-Australia Airlines. And it was really my love of flying that stemmed from that, I think, being taken to the airport and taken into the hangars and seeing aeroplanes in bits. So once that gets into your blood, it's there for good. So I've been very fortunate and blessed in many ways that I've been able to indulge that passion over the years, as you mentioned in the beginning. And the thing about flying as a pilot is that it gives you a different perspective on terrestrial events, let's say. Because once you're in charge of an aeroplane and you take off and you look down, everybody looks so small, but it's not just the people who look small, it's the problems and the trials and tribulations that people have that look small as well. They tend to fade away when you're flying. And I've always found that a very useful perspective to have, because a lot of things that we worry about and obsess over are not actually very significant at all in the scheme of things. But it's very easy for us to focus on those in the here and now and lose sight of the things that are actually important.
True.
I spent some time just a few years ago living in the UK with my wife, and I was lecturing at the local university in the business school there. And I was lecturing on business topics through from first year undergraduates right up to master's students. And what I found was that the first years tended to put some kind of a book in front of them on the desk where they were. The young ladies would put their enormous handbags up typically, And while I was talking away at the front, giving them the very best good oil, they'd actually be on their phones or other devices where I couldn't actually see them and furtively working away there on social media. So I finally kind of, I didn't exactly do my nut, but I just thought I'd point out to these people, I said, who do you think benefits from what you're doing with Facebook or whatever it is on that phone? I said, because primarily it's there to make money for the companies that are benefiting from your presence on that medium. It doesn't actually benefit you at all. It's actually for the benefit of others. So just bear that in mind the next time you want to have a 6-hour binge on your social media. But nonetheless, it is part of the fabric of life. But I think it's good to see that there are forces at work now and over the last 2 or 3 years pushing back against the less desirable aspects of it, and including, for that matter, the addiction that many people can feel.
Going back to your childhood, that your father was your first real mentor?
Well, I guess he was in certain ways. I wouldn't say that he was an active mentor always in the respects that I see and have come to see mentoring now, but he did with me some of the things that I've done with my children, and I'm in particular thinking of introducing me to aviation and to aeroplanes and, you know, the smell and sight of large airliners and that kind of thing. I've actually still got the teddy bear that I got at the age of 3 when I attended the TAA Christmas picnic for the children up in Brisbane at Eagle Farm Airport. So they set up a Christmas tree in one of the hangars, and that little teddy bear was the gift that I got. So it tends to cement the aviation environment and the whole ethos of it in your mind. And that never left me, so it's come back to me at various times. And that's why I got my private pilot licence in 1977, and also why I ended up going to the US, to Florida specifically, in 1990 to do my airline pilot training there. So I had 2 wonderful years. If I could have cloned myself, I could have worked 24/7 flight instructing, I think. That was a big flight school. They had maybe 250 students, 60 aeroplanes and 50 instructors.
Wow.
And it was just a fabulous place to be. There were students from all over the world. So it was a very cosmopolitan environment, very structured. And at the time, at least, the US was a great place to fly. So I just enjoyed the hell out of it, not to put too fine a point on it. Had 2 great years there.
Cool.
So yes, getting back to your question about my father, I think what he did and I'm sure he did mentor me in a lot of ways, but I think one of the most significant things was through his involvement as a senior executive with TAA. He introduced me to aviation in probably the best way, because I got, as I say, to see aeroplanes in bits and experience the smell of aviation fuel and kerosene, and that's another constituent of my bloodstream, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, that was very important to me. And of course he worked in an engineering discipline, so he had a very engineering oriented approach to life, and I found that suited my own preferences very well, and that I'm sure was one of the things that led me into engineering. Although the branch of engineering that I initially entered was not the one that I stayed in for all that long, because that was mining engineering and I gained a degree in that. But then within a couple of years I found that it didn't offer me enough challenges, really. I mean, I would much have preferred to be boring holes in the sky rather than boring holes in the ground, which is what mining was all about. But somewhere during that early period of my career, I discovered earth mover tyres. I'm talking about the very large tyres that are used on mining equipment. And one of my drivers always has been to leave my mark on life. And what I realised I'd found in earth mover tyres was a field that nobody knew practically anything about, at least in the mining scene. Now, of course, the tyre manufacturers knew how to make tyres, but they didn't really care too much if you poked holes in them with rocks or whatever. They just sell you another one and off you'd go. But my interest really was to develop processes for managing tyres to get the most out of them. Bearing in mind that then, and I think still now, the cost of running tyres on big mining equipment typically accounts for about a third of the total running cost, and it's second only to the cost of fuel. So that means that something like 30% of the cost of running a big truck would be accounted for by the tyre running cost. But the fact is, if you manage those tyres effectively, if you choose the right ones, number one, and number two, if you maintain them in the most optimal way, you're going to get potentially 50% more life out of the same tyre that you would get if you don't select them with care and don't maintain them in the best possible way. So I'd really found my little spot in heaven with earth mover tyres, because it was a field that gave me an opportunity for an enormous amount of field research and practical research. And I think it's reasonable to say that in my work in the late 1970s and early 80s, I created the foundations for tyre management as we now know it, because when I came on the scene, it didn't exist. So it was a fascinating process to be involved in that. I spent a lot of that time at Newman, running a contract on behalf of a Perth-based company for Mount Newman Mining, as they then were, and that consisted of managing a team of people to service and change the tyres and maintain the pressures, among other things. But my primary role was to act as a consultant to help Mount Newman Mining maximise the life of its tyres. So being on that site, and if we look in, say, 1976, Mount Newman Mining had 78 large trucks then. So that was an enormous fleet by world standards at the time. And it just gave me tremendous scope to be able to, first of all, think about things, and I'll come back to that, but also to try things out with, of course, the approval of the mining company, and see what worked, and then apply those things and have them made into the fabric of the way that tyres were purchased by Mount Newman Mining, later BHP Iron Ore, and then also the role in maintaining and maximising the life. Now, I mentioned a moment ago about the notion of having time to think, and I think that's something that we've largely lost now, because when I was there at Newman in the 1970s, although I had a very onerous role in managing the tyres and making recommendations about purchases and all the rest of it, setting up guarantees, I wasn't frantically busy. So that gave me time to think about things and work out what needed to be done and in what priority order those things needed to be done, and then to do those things and put them into practice. So in that way, I believe that Newman, in the sense of tyres among many other things, but particularly with tyres, became the world's leader in managing tyres and extracting the maximum amount of life out of them. Now, of course, that saved Mount Newman Mining a significant amount of money, and they were very happy to continue the contract that our company had with them. In fact, that contract started on the 20th of August 1972, and as far as I know, the same company still has that contract So if it isn't in the Guinness Book of Records, it certainly deserves to be there. But really these days, and one thing that gaining a few grey hairs along the way, and I should stress only a couple here and there, has enabled me to do is to maintain a perspective on what's important. Because with the encroachment of technology and things like social media so heavily into our lives, it's just infiltrated its way into the fabric of our lives in a very insidious way. And if we're not careful, we can be caught in the trap of busyness, where that busyness isn't necessarily achieving us things. I mean, I read the other day that the average person spends 4 or 5 hours or more on their mobile phone each day. Now, that concerns me, because it means that if I were doing that, and I don't, but if I were doing that, that would mean that people whose offerings and streamings on my mobile device I was viewing or listening to had potentially an inordinate influence over my life. And I really think it's important for people to understand that there are bigger things in life than looking at your Facebook feed and seeing who's given you likes. And of course, the research tells us too that we become addicted to the endorphins that those likes and related positive emotions expressed by nameless others, people who we'll never know and don't know now, can have a very deleterious effect on us, because it's kind of addicting us to those endorphins, but in the end it's all a virtual world. So
going back to your position at Mount Wellbeck, I remember you telling me a story about the incident about the pen.
Ah, yes, the pen. Well, I included that story in my book because it turned out to be a pivotal moment for me in my life and my development as a human being and as a leader. But I can assure you it didn't feel that way at the time. Now, in the mid-70s, I hadn't been at Newman for very long, and I didn't consider myself really to be a leader. In fact, I never really even thought about the concept of leadership, because my title was, I think, area manager at the time. So I had responsibility for our people at Newman, but also for doing consulting to other iron ore mines in the area, say from Rio Tinto in particular. So I saw myself as a manager because that was what I was called. And what I didn't realise was that because I was in charge of people, that alone made me a leader. Because I had responsibility for people, I was a leader whether I liked it or not, or whether I realised it or not. So nonetheless, I was a diligent manager, and one of the things that I kept an eye on was our costs. And I was looking at the cost printout at the end of one particular month, and I noticed we seemed to have spent a lot of money on stationery. And when I drilled down into it, I found that we seemed to have spent an inordinate amount of money on ballpoint pens. Now, a ballpoint pen, which all of the tyre servicemen needed, is probably a 20-cent item if you buy them in bulk. So even if we'd been supplying the whole town's black market with ballpoint pens, the amount that we would have spent on it would still have been insignificant in the scheme of things. But nonetheless, I fixated on this ballpoint pen expenditure, and I became enraged at the thought that we were wantonly wasting this money on ballpoint pens. So really, without giving the matter enough consideration, I drew up a notice, had my office manager type it, and stuck it up in the crib room where the servicemen went for their smokos and lunches. And this notice said that in future, if any of you want a new pen, you're going to have to bring the old one into the office and prove that it's no longer usable. Now, of course, the first problem is that you've got these servicemen going up the mine, and they were all men then, by the way, and so they'd get down all fours to get under a truck to place the jack, and the pens would fall out of their top pocket and into the dust, and that'd be the last you'd see of them. But irrespective of the practicalities of this situation not being in my favour, the men became enraged at the thought that I trusted them to work on millions of dollars worth of tyres, but seemingly I didn't trust them with a few bucks worth of pens. So they had a very quick union meeting, and I reckon if it went 30 seconds, that would be the absolute top. And the shop steward came in and he said, look, let me make it very clear. Unless you withdraw this requirement, we're all going to go on strike. So I thought, well, what's our client, Mount Newman Mining, going to think if our workforce, which was so critical to the mine, were to go on strike over probably 50 bucks worth of pens? And I very quickly reached the conclusion that it probably wasn't a good idea to let that happen. So I took down the notice and removed that requirement. Now, thinking back, I probably breathed something of a sigh of relief at the time, thinking that I'd solved my problem. But in fact, my problems were only just beginning, because although I understand it now, I didn't understand it then. What I'd actually done was lost my men's trust. Now, I don't recall how much trust they had in me anyway, because although I've written a book now about trust and care, this one here, From Technocrat to Leader, trust wasn't a big item in my thinking at the time. It now looms very large. But the problem was, with that one trivial thing, I'd lost whatever trust my men had for me, and I didn't realise it. So I never set about trying to fix that up and regain that trust. Now, if the same situation arose now, and I found what I thought was excessive expenditure over something like pens, first of all, I wouldn't rush out and have a notice printed and put it up in the crib room. I'd probably have a cup of tea and maybe sleep on it, think how I felt about it the following morning, and then decide what was the best course of action. But nonetheless, having done what I did, I could still have recovered the situation. I could have called the men together, had a meeting with them, apologised for doing something so foolish, and maybe put on a barbecue for them, and even bought them a very nice pen, probably not a ballpoint pen, out of my own pocket and given it to each of them as a gift. And I'm sure they would have appreciated the gift, but more particularly, they would have appreciated my honesty and my humility in admitting to them that I'd done the wrong thing and doing my best to put it right. And I think if I'd done that, they would have spoken among themselves and they would have said, well, he realises that he made a pretty silly mistake. He's acknowledged it, he's apologised for it, and he's made amends, and we don't think that he's going to do that again, so let's give him another shot. But really, I didn't do any of that, unfortunately, and the morale in that workforce kind of limped along for a long time, bumped along the bottom, really, and I was bewildered. And I just couldn't understand what had gone wrong, because the management work that I was doing was going extremely well. The client was very happy, not only with the service we provided, but also with the consulting work that I did for them in reducing tyre and rim costs. And the men had secure employment, although I don't think they altogether appreciated that it was the success of what the company was doing that helped to secure that employment, because we certainly had the foxes circling the hen house, let's say. It became over the 70s and 80s a competitive environment. There were some other companies that were desperate to get that contract because, in fact, Newman had become what the Japanese refer to as a cowbell client in terms of the management of earth mover tyres. In other words, you've got the lead cow that wears the bell and everybody else follows and looks to them. And that was what most people in the world who knew about Newman did in relation to tyres. We set the standard. So things like that do make a difference. And in fact, in 1994, when I was back there, one of these competing companies was again desperate to get that contract, but the client decided not to put it even out to tender because they said, we're very happy with what you folk are doing and we just don't feel that it's necessary to expose the whole process to a competitive environment.
I guess one of the main points I want to touch on there was just the fact that as a leader, people look at you today as you are right now and just assume that you've always been this way. And it takes these little hiccups along the way, whether they be little or bigger, to help shape you into the person you are today. So anyone who is, a leader in any way, shape or form, if you do make a mistake somewhere, just make sure you learn from it. Maybe write it down in the journal or, just, put it in the back of your mind, like you say, go and have a cup of tea or sleep on it and don't react emotionally. Yeah.
Yes, very good advice. Well, in many ways, I'm glad that people can only see me now as I am, because it must be said that for many years I was a bit of a prat. And I openly acknowledge that, because the reason I chose this title for my book is that I spent 4 years doing an engineering degree in Melbourne, and of that 4 years, I only spent 1 hour on leadership or supervision stuff. So 1 hour in 4 years, at least subconsciously, it conditions you to thinking that, well, the technical stuff that they've spent 3 years and 11 3/4 months teaching me about, that's what's really important. And maybe the people stuff just sort of looks after itself. But of course, eventually you find, and it was through certain pivotal experiences like the saga of the pens, that it's actually the other way around. Of course, you've got to have technical competence, but at the same time, as a leader, it'll be your inability to lead people in the most appropriate way that will bring you unglued. And certainly for too much of my career, and I'm thinking my early career because I did learn my lessons, but for too much of my early career, I was quite, as I used the word before, bewildered and struggling to understand why morale was low and people were very wary of me, I think. People didn't trust me. And of course, under it all, I was actually a very trustworthy person, but I didn't realise that people were making judgments about that aspect of me based on a handful of things that I probably didn't regard as all that important at the time, but other people, my workforce, I'm thinking particularly, were making judgments about me based on things like that notice about the pens. And the problem with the sort of resentment that as a leader you can create by a thoughtless act like that is that it doesn't go away by itself. That resentment, and I can define resentment as ill feeling, say on my part, out of a sense of having been badly treated by someone. So I've no doubt that my workforce resented me over that. And the problem with resentment is that it doesn't go away by itself. it might be dulled with the passing of time, but then something will come along and trigger it again, some seemingly trivial but thoughtless act, and then it brings it all back. So unless you first of all are very mindful of the concept of resentment and of the need to avoid creating it, and secondly of the notion that if you sense resentment from people, you need to go in and explore that and find out why they resent you so that you can do something about it. Now, in doing that, you may have to eat some humble pie, and I think my diet consisted mainly of humble pie there for a while. Fortunately, it's fairly nutritious. But the fact is, unless you're prepared as a leader to show your humility and to acknowledge when you've made a mistake and to make amends to people that you may have wronged unintentionally, in all probability, along the way, then those resentments just sit there in the background and fester, and they await a trigger event to manifest again, and then you're back where you started. It brings up people's feelings of ill will, and it's just a cycle that goes on repeating itself. So as a leader, that's certainly one thing that I've learned in spades, the importance of being aware of resentment, of avoiding creating it, of being mindful if there is resentment toward you, and then of the need to go in and find out what the source of that is and do your best to put it right.
So from there you went on to the Bureau of Gravitas. Did you take those learnings into there?
Yes, well, that came about because in 1999 I'd finished work having spent 2 years in Chile working on the Escondida copper mine, which is up at 10,000 feet in the Andes in northern Chile. I'd been running another tyre management contract for Minera Escondida. They had a very large fleet of trucks, large loaders and the like, support equipment. So I spent 2 years there and secured an extension to that contract. But then I decided that I needed to change. Chile was a wonderful place to live, a fascinating place, very challenging professionally, because when I went there at the end of 97, of the 3,000 employees on the mine, only 50 of them were expatriates. And of those 3,000 Chileans, very few of them spoke English. So it's an extremely challenging environment to be in. But nonetheless, I gained work in Canada. I was taken on as the vice president of a joint venture between a Canadian and an American company. Now, unfortunately, due to no fault of mine, one of the suppliers, in fact, the major supplier, decided late in the piece that this venture was not in their interest to support with supply of goods. So unfortunately, the venture collapsed. And I found myself back in Australia in 2000. And whilst I wasn't quite as white-haired as I am now, I had a few flecks of white in there. And unfortunately, it wasn't a very good time to be looking for work if you were mature-aged. So I fruitlessly searched for work for quite some time, and that in itself is quite a humbling and disempowering experience. And then in early 2001, I went to a state government-sponsored course that helped people to, mature-age people in particular, how to, in finding work. Now, the course was actually not of much help, because like most people, they didn't understand what made it difficult for mature-age people to get work. And it actually, in the end, it had very little to do with age discrimination. But the big advantage of attending that course was that I met 2 other people there, one of whom was the facilitator, the other a course member like me. And we quickly realised that we were kindred spirits, that we understood that as mature age people, we all had an enormous amount to offer an employer, but due to various factors, and I'll mention them in a moment, mature age people just were having a very tough time of it. So we started to meet. Initially, that was in the second quarter of 2001. Initially, we met really just for mutual support and to have somewhere to go and to meet with people in a similar situation. But we very quickly fell to analysing what it was that made it difficult for people to get work. And we identified a number of factors. The first was that for those people who are unemployed and on Centrelink benefit, the Centrelink process is very threatening. So what Centrelink does, and I mean, Centrelink's a great organisation. They provide benefits for lots of people who are absolutely worthy of receiving those benefits. But of course, it's the small minority who muck it up for everybody else by doing the wrong thing. And so what Centrelink would do is they would send a job seeker quite threatening letters to say, for example, if you didn't apply for 20 jobs in a calendar month and provide proof of having done so with a job application diary or similar, then they'd cut your benefit off. So the problem was, first of all, people became quite dispirited receiving these sorts of letters, which typically weren't aimed at them. They were aimed at the people who didn't do the right thing. But nonetheless, everybody got a letter just to say, well, you know, do the right thing or there'll be consequences. So people would become very dispirited and disempowered. And part of the reason is that Centrelink said, well, look, you've got to apply, for argument's sake, 20 jobs in that calendar month. So instead of applying for positions that people actually wanted, they just go to the paper or on the Seek website or whatever, and they'd put in an application, they'd fill their quota, but quite frankly, if they'd got any of those jobs, they would have been probably horrified because they didn't actually want any of them. And of course, their chances of getting a job when you don't want it are automatically reduced because it comes through in your covering letter that you're really just filling a job application quota and you don't give a damn whether you get it or not. It comes through in the way that you phrase your CV. If you actually have the tremendous luck of getting an interview, then it's probably going to come out in the interview that you just want a job, you don't want that particular job. But of course, employers don't want people who just want a job. They want people who want one of their jobs, and that they're people who are passionate about wanting to work for them and improve their company through that work. So the three of us, we developed what we termed our personal empowerment program as a result of the realisation about things like the disempowerment of the process, and also the realisation of the shame that many mature age people feel if they've lost their jobs. Now, around that period, there are a vast number of retrenchments going on. One of the major banks retrenched about 6,000 people in one hit nationally. Now, of course, at the time, for erroneous reasons, a lot of the people who were retrenched first were the older people. So the employers probably said, well, you know, these older people have had a shot at career, so we don't want to retrench the young people because they're yet to make their mark and all the rest of them are in the middle. So we'll start with the grey hairs and we'll cull them first. So we ran this program very successfully. Now, it was a 6-week program at the rate of 1 2-hour session a week. We ran it in a number of venues. We had people from the state government, clients referred from there. We had clients referred by the job networks and also from disability service providers. Now, we kept records with the job networks of the success rates that we achieved, because the whole purpose of this course was to help people get back into work if that was their choice. So what we found with our major client was that 78% of the participants, after a period of 6 months, were back into meaningful activity. Now, not everybody wanted work, because we said to people, well, look, use this period when you're not working as an opportunity to decide what you do want to do and then go and pursue that. Don't just pursue some income-making activity that's actually meaningless to you, because in 3 months you're going to be out on the street again, having become totally disenchanted with it. So 78% of the participants from that client got back to meaningful activity, and 61% of the total found work. Now these, from that client, these were people, mature age people, who'd been out of work for over 12 months. So we basically got the contents of the too hard basket. And the statistics at the time were that if you as a mature age person had been out of work for 12 months or more, you had a negligible prospect of getting back into work again. Due to disempowerment, becoming dispirited, you just give it away. So it's the hidden unemployed. You know, you're no longer looking for work because you just don't see any point in it. So we were enormously proud of the number of people that we helped, and we probably put about 1,000 people through that course in the time that we were running it. And then in late 2004, the minerals boom in Western Australia was really kicking off. And I remember travelling on an early flight up to Karratha one morning. That would have been in about 2005, and remarking to myself on the number of grey-haired heads that I could see down the aisle of the plane. So what it actually showed was that when push came to shove, and the minerals boom was sucking up people from all sorts of places, sending them to the mine. So then not only mining and oil and gas were hiring mature age, but a lot of other organisations as well. And what it showed was that the reasons for getting rid of mature age people were never that good in the first place, and that when the need arose, those people were being hired. So in a sense, that was gratifying too. But what it did mean was that by early 2005, we were no longer receiving enough clients to make the business viable.
On that, how was the business put together in the sense that where was your money stream coming from?
Well, the money stream came from the organisations to which the government paid money to help people get work. So, for example, with the job network, if an unemployed person registers with a job network, which they must do in order to receive a benefit, the job network receives a certain amount of money from the government for looking after that person and monitoring them and perhaps putting them into courses and helping them generally find work. So we were receiving a part of that payment. But of course, part of the issue too was that the job network would really have preferred to hang on to that money, all of it that the government was giving to them, so they weren't really that much incentivised to hand some of it over to us. So there, I'd have to say that there probably was an issue with the funding model, but nonetheless, you know, these are just the challenges that you face in business.
Mm. And that was your first business?
Yeah, it was.
Yep.
It was. Well, it was the first business anyway that I'd been involved in with other people.
Yep.
I did run a tyre consulting business in the late 1980s for a couple of years, and that went very well, but I must say I didn't really enjoy working alone, because of course my accountant in that business introduced me to the term one-man band, where you're blowing the trumpet and beating the drum and trying to play the violin with your other hand. So when you're the only person in a business, it is very challenging because you're wearing a lot of hats.
Yeah.
And the thing about small business is that you probably went into that business because you had some expertise or knowledge of the technical aspects of the business. So for example, let's say you do a plumbing apprenticeship, and for a couple of years you work for somebody who runs a plumbing business, employs half a dozen plumbers or whatever, and then you think to yourself, well, blow this guy's making all the money out of me and I'm just making a wage. So you decide to go into business. But of course, what you don't necessarily realise is that while you were sleeping in your bed at night, the owner of the business that employed you was back in the office doing the books, perhaps worrying about the size of the bank loan that he was carrying, worrying about the personal guarantee that he'd had to give the bank to get that loan, and that if his business went belly up, he'd probably lose his house. So suddenly you're confronted with all these realities. And the problem is that people often, I think, who go into small business, and I don't in any sense decry it, but one has to be aware of the pitfalls. But people who go into a small business, like the plumber I talked about, they know the plumbing business, or they know the business of being a plumber, but they don't know anything about managing cash flow or getting loans or marketing the business. Because as an employee plumber, you never had to worry about that. That was the boss's job. So if he didn't drum up any business for you, you just kind of sat there and probably got paid anyway. But suddenly now you're responsible for every penny that comes in the door, and you've got to manage the cash, and you've got to pay for vehicles and tools and that kind of thing. And so when your $1,000 drain cleaner gets stuck down the drain, as an employee plumber, you just go home and say, oh, well, these things happen. But the boss has got to dig into his pocket to find the $1,000 to replace it. So it's a very different thing. And I think the problem is that a lot of people who say to themselves, well, I'm going to go into small business because I'll be my own boss. Well, guess what? Instead of having one boss, you've now probably got about half a dozen or a dozen.
Very true. And
you, unfortunately, probably don't have all the skills you need to do all those aspects of the business very well. And so, people founder at that. But some people go on and do very well, so it can be done.
We're sort of getting to the end of the podcast, unfortunately.
Sure.
I did get a feel that before this started that we'd probably have to have a couple of catch-ups to get through your whole story, because there's so much to go through. I guess to touch on a couple of small things, I was wondering what 3 books would you recommend, outside of your own, of course?
3 copies of my own.
3 books for a start-out entrepreneur.
Yes, well, there's a challenging question. Well, first of all, I think rather than starting with a book, and I'm not evading your question here, I'll come back to that. I think if I were thinking of going into my own business, the first thing I'd do is find someone in a business like that owns their own business that I could talk to, and they wouldn't necessarily act as my ongoing mentor, but somebody who could be realistic and honest with you about the sorts of challenges that you're going to face. Because here's the conundrum with an entrepreneur. In order to take the plunge and go into business, you've got to have a high level of optimism and a high level of confidence that you can make it succeed. Now, that's all good. But unfortunately, at times our optimism can blind us to the realities of what we're going to face. But once we get into that business, those realities are going to be there. Like they say in the X-Files, it's the truth is out there. Well, guess what? You get into business, you've got to buy a vehicle, you've got to rent premises, maybe someone to do admin for you, and suddenly you find that you've got costs that tick along irrespective of how much or whether any money comes in the door. So I would put aside my initial enthusiasm and I would find somebody, maybe even more than one person, but certainly one person who was willing to sit me down for an hour or so and tell me the realities of what I would probably face. Now, I never did that. And here's what you find, because let's say that you're working in some kind of a job. It might be a well-paid job, but you feel unfulfilled. You're an employee and it's secure and you've got the money coming in, which is easy to take for granted until it isn't coming in. So you're daydreaming one day and you think, well, look, I think it's time I backed myself and went into business. So you start thinking about it, and then sooner or later you start talking to your family and to your friends about it. And statistically, here is what happens. People initially will be very supportive. They say, oh, that's wonderful, you're going to go into business, that's terrific. Because people who aren't in business, who work as employees, is what I mean, generally speaking, have very little idea, in my experience, of what being in business entails. So, I mean, if they're an employee, say work for the government or whatever, the salary just arrives in the bank every fortnight and you do your job and on you go. But really, being in business is a totally different kettle of fish. So that's the first thing I do, because the problem is the people who will encourage you, then when you go into business and maybe it doesn't do so well and, 70% of whatever it is of new small businesses have failed within a year and something like 90% have gone under within 3 years. And then those very same people who gave you so much encouragement in the beginning, but who don't have any skin in your particular game, they will say, oh, gee, that's, you tell them that you're going to have to wind the business up. They'll say, oh, that's a real shame, I'm really sorry to hear that. And then, the conversation moves on to something else. So my point here is that when you're talking and thinking about starting a business, you can always find people who'll be supportive of that idea. But that support actually means bugger all. Put it this way, if you want to cut that out, it means next to nothing. Because as I say, those people generally have no skin in the game, and talk is cheap. And they want to encourage you. They're your friends or your family or whatever. So, but that encouragement, which does have its effect on people, because perhaps they see that you're unfulfilled in the work you're doing and you suddenly think of something that will lead to your fulfillment, in your mind at least. So people want to support that. But that's something to be very wary about, because it won't help you in the long run. You're far better to put all of that aside and go and speak to people who have been there and done it and find out what their experience is.
I think that's very, very wise advice. Where can everyone find you?
Well, if you Google Donald Macrae Gordon...
Not Donald Gordon Macrae?
No, that's right. Very good. I've used my full name there because I thought, well, it's a good Scottish name, and but if you Google Donald Macrae Gordon or even Don Gordon, you'll find me. You'll find where the book's available. It's available through numbers of gimmicks. If you contact me, I can sell you a copy. But notwithstanding that I wrote it, the reason that I wrote it was, and we haven't really touched on this much today, is that I found that there were too many people that I encountered in my working life that I couldn't trust, particularly people that I worked for. Now, sometimes these were people who said, well, I have these values that I bring to the business, and it turned out that when the chips were down, they didn't really have those values at all. But what I found, and this was my experience, that if as a leader I worked hard to be trusted, then I could gain that trust and maintain it. And that enabled me to show care for people, which is really probably the most important thing. Now, we hear about the so-called Great Resignation, which was first, I think, publicised in the US in the last year or so, where, not coincidentally, but with the advent of COVID, it's helped people to think about whether they really wanted to be in the jobs they were in. And a lot of people, far more than normal, have concluded that they don't want to be in the jobs they're in, and they've resigned. And I saw a comment the other day on LinkedIn which amused me. Somebody said, well, maybe people are resigning because the culture of so many of these companies is poor. And the reality is that the culture of a lot of companies could be dramatically improved if the top people were committed to being trustworthy and to being trusted, and in turn were enabled by that trust which their people showed them and had for them to care for those people. Because when you're in a caring environment at work, you feel enfolded and you don't want to leave. It's a very good feeling to have. So really that's what prompted me to write the book, and it's certainly going to benefit people who either are budding leaders or, for example, people in leadership roles where the people side of it isn't going so well, and like I was so many years ago, are bewildered as to why that is.
Well, Don, again, I would like to thank you very much for being a part of the podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you on board.
Thank you.
Everyone, I can highly recommend reading this book. If you're looking at developing yourself as a leader or just as a person, a great book to read. Highly recommend. Again, Don's one of the nicest people, one of the most qualified people I know to, give all sorts of advice, definitely around business and leadership. So please, if you've got any burning questions, reach out to him, reach out to me. I'll pass on any, information questions onto Don. And I'll make sure I get back to you. So again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.